Hi, my name is Jillian. Me and Hannah are going to be talking about some takeaways from working at a sleepaway camp. Hannah and I both worked at a girls' horse camp where the girls were staying there for anywhere from 5 to, in Hannah's case, 14 days. This is going to be a guide to creating a safe and fun horse camp experience on a little bit of a lesser scale from former staff. As I mentioned, my name is Jillian Seeker. I go by Jill at the barn because it's easier to yell. I was the head wrangler at Palomar Christian Conference Center from 2018 to 2020. I was overseeing all the equestrian activities during camp and helping run a small trail ride string during the off season. I'm a CHA Level 2 certified instructor, Western and English, and I'm also a FAST certified registered therapeutic riding instructor with many summers teaching summer horse camps and adaptive riding lessons during the year at Ride on Therapeutic Horsemanship.
Hi everyone, my name's Hannah Morton. I'm also a PATH registered therapeutic riding instructor. I was a riding instructor at Skylark Ranch Girl Scout Camp in the summer of 2019. I taught lessons there for our general campers as well as more advanced lessons for application-based riding programs. I was going to come back to Skylark Ranch the following summer as the head riding instructor, but unfortunately due to COVID that fell through. I work at Ride on Therapeutic Horsemanship where I teach adaptive riding lessons, and I also teach able-bodied riding lessons and lead trail rides at our Rancho Potrero Community Equestrian Center location.
So really quickly, I'm going to give you guys an overview of what a standard day looked like at Palomar Christian Conference Center. For our horse camp, the girls would arrive on Sunday afternoon and they would leave Saturday morning. Where am I? We had time set apart to groom and tack in the mornings. There was time to change between activities and a designated nap time after lunch. Camp days were really, really packed. So by the end of the week, the rest was well received by even the most excitable campers. Transition times were dutifully observed and set out ahead of time, and the schedule was law. We never let the campers know what was happening next, which was something we called WAFO, wait and find out. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that when we talk about managing campers. At Palomar, we had 3 different classes that we would go through. Daily, these campers would rotate through all 3 of these classes. The classes were about an hour long. They would have a riding class where they learned riding skills, got to play mounted games, and then in their horse science class, they would learn about horse parts, breeds, and horsemanship, do barn chores. They would also develop a drill pattern with their wrangler counselor that they would practice in their riding class for our shodio at the end of the week. Campers also got to do vaulting daily with stretching, practice on the barrel with their compulsory and freestyle moves. And they also got to practice on our wonderful Stony, who is our vaulting horse.
We had a similar class rotation at Skylark Ranch. Every camper involved in a riding program there would spend an hour each day doing their riding lesson and then an additional hour doing what we called theory, which was just learning about horses and horsemanship on the ground. And then each camper in a riding program would also have the opportunity to do a single vaulting lesson. So each camper would have a turn practicing 3 or 4 moves on a barrel and then later on an actual horse. So now I'm going to talk through a couple of lesson plans that I used all the time working at camp and that since then I found to integrate really well as adaptive riding lesson plans. This first one here is sort of my go-to for a group of first-time riders. The majority of my riders at camp were kids who had never been on a horse before or maybe been on like once for a trail ride. I found that with riders getting on a horse for the first time ever, it can be really difficult as an instructor to know where to start. I find myself tempted to try to teach too much. I'll try to teach 2 riding skills, both direct reining and the walk-halt transition, because intuitively these are the basic skills that we need to be able to control the horse. But I learned after a while that, especially in a 30-minute lesson plan, like we do in some of our adaptive riding lessons, not only can this be super overwhelming, but by the end of the lesson, the riders will be performing both skills sort of okay. Versus if you focus on one at a time, the riders tend to really get the hang of the skill a lot more consistently by the end of the lesson. I choose to focus on walk-halt transitions before direct reining because I think it's a really important skill to learn for safety purposes. We all know that group lessons can get pretty chaotic sometimes, and it's important to be able to yell, "Hey, everybody stop your horse," and just have the lesson come to a pause where you can reset and move on from there. I like this particular lesson plan because it allows for practicing the walk halt transition without too much need to go into the mechanics of steering. Obviously, if we're going to have our riders going around without being able to steer, it's important that each horse has a volunteer leader or spotter to sort of fill in the gaps before we can get to that next riding skill in a next lesson. So for this lesson plan, my objective will be to have each rider demonstrate a walk to halt transition between these two cones at least 2 times each direction with leaders and sidewalkers as needed for the rider's ability. As I said, the riding skill is walk to halt transitions. In this case, each rider and horse will have a leader and sidewalkers as needed. And my arena setup is these 2 cones that will be placed just off the rail with enough room to walk in between the cones and the rail. I will first perform a tack and safety check, checking girths, making sure helmets fit, all that kind of stuff. To mount my riders, if they are able, for the first time riding a horse, I think it's best to use a mounting block where possible, just because if I try to use a ramp and then transition to using a block later, the mounting block becomes kind of this like scary thing. But if you just use that from the very beginning and that's how your rider knows how to get on a horse, then it becomes a lot easier to use. With a group of first-time riders, before we even start walking, I'm going to talk them through just the basic aids to control their horse. I'm going to explain squeeze your legs around the horse's stomach to go, pull the reins back to stop. The other thing that I want to make sure the riders understand before we start walking is the correct way to hold the reins. It can be a lot more difficult than you think to try to explain that. Like if they're holding it backwards and you say flip your hand over, the words don't always make sense. So it's best to just show everybody right there before you start walking. Once we get moving, the first warm-up exercise that I like to use is to have them practice dropping and picking up their reins a couple of times, just to make sure that you're really drilling in the correct way to hold the reins. And you're not going to get halfway through the lesson and look around and see people holding their reins backwards. I also like to use any sort of stretcher exercise that involves letting go of the reins and letting go of the saddle. I like backwards arm circles just because it encourages correct posture and sitting up tall, but anything of that nature would work just fine. It's just important to familiarize first-time riders with the idea that they don't have to keep like a death grip on the saddle, and it will just help them be a little bit more relaxed up there. Next, I'm going to go over in a little bit more detail the aid for a walk to halt transition. I'm going to tell my riders that they're going to pull back gently on the reins and keep pulling until the horse stops, and then to place their hands back forward a little bit as soon as the horse comes to a halt. Then I'll have everybody practice their horses all at the same time on a count of 3 just to let them prepare a little bit. And I want to do this at least 3 times each direction. In this case, because our riders don't really know how to steer yet, you can use your volunteers to help coordinate that change of direction. After I've gone through having everybody halt all together, I'm going to progress to riders practicing their halt transition one at a time. This is where these 2 cones are going to come in. So the riders will be walking down the rail. At some point after they've passed the first cone and before they reach the second cone, they're going to pull back and stop their horse. I would do this 2 or more times each direction, depending on how much time you have. And once you've gone through this far, you have a couple of options for how you can finish your lesson. If you like this riding skill and you want to progress this even further, you can move the cones closer and closer together so that the riders are forced to perform a more prompt transition because there's less space to do it. Or if you think your group would enjoy a game, it's a really excellent way to use red light, green light. It's a super simple game, but super effective. I really like this game because it's performed on a straight line, and so it requires really minimal steering. For the purposes of this lesson, I would just ask my volunteers to make sure that the horses are staying on a straight line and that they're keeping an appropriate distance from one another. So then the riders are able to focus just on performing the walk halt transitions. Red light, green light also makes the fun of the game is in the promptness of the transition and halting quickly and walking on quickly. And so it emphasizes in a fun way this skill that's really important for rider safety.
Before we talk,
sorry,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Before we talk a little bit more about a lesson with limited volunteers, I wanted to jump in with a little bit of what we would do before riders who had not gotten a chance to ride before, who had only done very minimal riding. What we would do before riders ever got on at Palomar was we would do a safety talk, where we would go through all of the aids that they were going to be using on their horse. We would do the aids for the start, the stop, the steer, and how much space to keep in their horses so that they could have between their horses, so that they could have a visual before we even got on and even got in the arena. Hannah's going to talk a little bit more about teaching lessons with limited volunteers, which is a reality that we might be facing when we come back to teaching normal lessons in this post-COVID landscape.
Yeah. So just to finish off this first lesson plan before we move on, with a group of first-time riders, I think the best cool down is just to walk on the rail and ask questions. Kids who have just ridden a horse for the first time are going to have plenty of questions and comments to share with you. And if you're having trouble getting them to talk, you can always just ask, what was hard, what was easy, what was fun, what do you want to learn next time? Those kinds of things to just encourage your kids to reflect on whatever they learned. So moving on to lesson plans with limited volunteers. This is one that I used all the time working at camp. Because of our camp schedule, I often found myself teaching a lesson of 4 to 6 riders with only myself and maybe one other staff member on the ground. And more often than not, this staff member was just a general counselor, not a riding staff, and so didn't have a lot of horsemanship skills. So I had to learn very quickly some of the best ways to maintain a controlled, safe, and cohesive group lesson when you have more riders than you have volunteers. One of the most helpful things that I discovered that I now like to apply to pretty much all my group lessons is using cones and poles in the corner to help your riders remember to keep their horse on the rail. I had a lot of frustrating lessons in which I felt like I just spent the entire time just nagging my riders to stay on the rail and not cut their corners, and they would just keep drifting further and further towards the middle. And so I found that the cones to go around in the corners just create a visual aid to help the riders remember not to cut their corners, and it helps keep everybody where they're supposed to be. As far as this lesson plan goes, we're going to use the tendency of our horses to follow one another to our advantage. The goal of this lesson is to keep the riders in a single file line about 1 to 2 horse distances apart for the entire lesson. In doing this, the instructor is able to keep an eye on all of the riders at the same time. So I would have one volunteer to lead or spot the front horse, and then the other volunteer to kind of walk along the back 3 horses, ready to jump in wherever they're needed. I want to note that this lesson plan is really only appropriate for riders that have relative independence at the walk. You wouldn't want to use this in a case where you know your riders need a leader, but you just don't have it. That wouldn't be a particularly safe thing to do. So for this lesson plan, and any time that your volunteer help is limited, it's best to choose horses that are straightforward to steer so that no one's kind of getting dragged around and stuck. And you want to choose horses that have relatively equal walking speeds just to make it easier to keep this line formation. So my objective for this riding lesson is to have each rider demonstrate a 20-meter circle at the walk, staying in line with the other horses twice each direction. My riding skill is direct reining, and in this hypothetical lesson plan, we have 4 riders and 2 volunteers plus the instructor. So I'm going to begin again with a tack and safety check. I'm going to mount my riders however they would usually mount for this lesson. When using this lesson plan format, you can include any stretches or warm-ups that you would usually use for this group of riders. But I would note that the reins should always be held in at least one hand so that your riders still have the ability to steer without a leader. And I would avoid any warm-up exercises that involve leaning down or looking down and away from the horse, like stretching forward towards the ears, touching toes, those kinds of things, just because they can distract the rider's focus from watching where they're going. After I've gone through warm-up exercises, I'm going to review the correct technique for direct reining, emphasize that we don't want anybody crossing reins over the horse's neck, using one rein at a time, opening up away from the horse's neck. The first thing we're going to do as a group is just to practice riding in a line on the rail. I'm going to remind the riders to use their, whichever is the outside rein, to keep their horse from drifting towards the center of the arena. And I'm going to remind my riders what proper spacing is. I'm going to tell them to stay 1 to 2 horse distances apart from each other and offer ways they can maintain this spacing. In this case, since we want to stay in a line, I would just have them either halt or slow down their horse anytime that they feel they're getting too close. Once we've gone around a couple times and I feel like they're consistently correcting and staying in this line, I would progress to having them steer a 20-meter circle staying in this line. This is a place where you can use that volunteer with the front horse to help keep things moving, have them make sure that the circle is large enough that all of the riders can follow on the same circle. And in this case, you can use the idea of having to stay in a line. It's a tool to keep your lesson orderly, but you can also use it as a challenge for your riders. Challenge them to maintain the speed of their horse to match that of the horse in front of them. Challenge them to be really precise about their steering so that they're staying directly in line. And again, you have your volunteers here to jump in wherever needed. You can do this 20-meter circle 2 times each direction. I think the best way to change direction when you're trying to maintain a line is just to cross a diagonal. And once you've gone through this activity, I like to introduce a game of follow the leader. It gives each rider a chance to lead the group, keep a volunteer with that rider in the front, and steer whatever circles and patterns they choose. And it turns this idea of riding in a line that might feel redundant after a while, it turns it into a fun game for the riders, and it gives them each a chance to be in the front. Once I've gone through this game and everybody has had an opportunity to be the leader, I'm just going to cool down by walking on the rail and asking my riders why they think it's important to keep spacing. This is a really good opportunity, since you've been talking about it the whole lesson, to remind them about the safety aspect of keeping spacing between horses. And you can ask them to share other ways that you might be able to make more space between you and the horse in front of you. This lesson plan, I used it a lot at camp just because of circumstances, but you know, as we're coming back, we're bringing back our riders and volunteers with our COVID protocols. We might find ourselves in a situation where we don't have as much help as would be ideal. So keeping all of our riders together, like in this lesson plan, is a really easy way to maintain a safe lesson and to keep your eye on everybody when you don't have as much help as you would normally expect.
One of the things that I really want to talk about that I absolutely love is we're going to demystify some drill patterns. Drill patterns terrified me at first. There's a lot going on, but they really are a lot of fun for your riders and a lot of fun for you too. Drill riding is simply where riders regulate their horse's speed and position so that the whole team is relatively in the same space to create formations that look really awesome. All of these maneuvers that you see on your screen are totally compatible with just doing at a walk. And they're an amazing exercise to help your riders team up and practice working together. Before you even get on for your lesson, you're going to pick out a few of these maneuvers and have your kids pick out a few of these maneuvers to try. And you're going to work out the logistics of them on paper and then have them walk through the maneuver on foot. Make sure that everyone is putting their own input in there and that they have the chance to get their voice heard. Once you get on your horses and in the arena, you want to encourage your riders to communicate with each other loudly throughout the entire warm-up and have them practice keeping an eye on where all the other riders in the arena are at all times. A great way to do this is by doing speed rating exercises such as riding in pairs or riding in a line, because it helps riders get an eye for how it feels to keep your horse shoulder to shoulder with another. And also how it is to rate your speed within a gait while you are on the move. It is a very, 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 very fun thing to do, but you also want to make sure you are being safe and using horses that are comfortable being around each other. And also a great way to help riders visualize these drill patterns if they have never done them before in the arena is to use visual markers such as cones, poles, or toys to give them a little bit more of a reference point. Finally, before we talk about the fun things, is managing campers. Obviously, you can't have fun unless you feel safe, and this is why we have rules. They are going to be your best friend. They are going to be what keeps your camper safe, keeps you safe, and makes everything be fun and go smoothly. You want to make sure that you go over with those rules with your campers very explicitly at the beginning of your camp, and that you make sure that you're reminding them. If you kind of have 3 core rules that you stick to every day and you keep repeating, and then obviously your horse safety rules. I like using, we only have use kind of encouraging words. We use our walking feet, and we always stay in groups of 3. You want to make sure that campers are always supervised and that you have adequate staff and that no one is wandering off anywhere alone, because that is how people get hurt. You can't, again, as I said, you can't have fun unless you feel safe. Games that don't involve teams are absolutely the best when it comes to playing games with your campers. Games that are just a big group effort are really awesome. They don't let kids feel left out and not getting picked on the right team. And they're really easy to have fun with, and you can join in on them too. You want to remember to stop an activity at its highest point, and so that way you can try and avoid boredom. As activities get kids start to get comfortable with an activity, there's a high point, and that's when everyone's having the most fun, and you want to stop the activity there and go try something new. Kids can be mean, so we want to make sure that we're monitoring them and one ear to the ground to make sure that everyone feels safe and included and comfortable. There are time wasters and silly songs that are awesome to fill dead space. As I said earlier, sticking to your schedule is the best way that you can keep things moving and make sure that everything gets done in the day. But also, sometimes dead space just happens, and so you want to make it super simple to have fun. There's a couple games that we're going to talk about in the Q&A, like Ninja, Look Up, Look Down, and Frogger, which are super easy. And some of them you can keep running throughout the entire week, like Frogger. Look Up, Look Down is super quick and fast to play. And Ninja's another one that's a great time killer, super fast to play once the kids get a hang of it. Sticking to your schedule is going to be your best friend. You're going to make that schedule ahead of time, and you're going to plan ahead for any of the possibilities from A to Z. The kids don't have to know that you were anticipating the unexpected, and as long as you have a backup plan and something to do, you are golden. As I said, your schedule is law, so make a schedule ahead of time and say, this is when we're changing activities, and stick to it. It's going to help your campers stay on track and help you get everything done in the day, and make sure that everyone kind of has an idea of doing things. They don't have to know what they're doing next. We have this thing called WAFO at Palomar, and WAFO is your best friend. You tell your kids, wait and find out. And they will be very angry about it, to be anticipating what they're doing next. And so don't be afraid to say WAFO every now and then. And last but not least, as I said earlier, engage directly with your kids. Make sure you're staying in on those conversations and help keep that playing field level, because at the end of the day, that's what's going to help everyone have fun and make sure that everyone is using appropriate talk. So we saved the best for last. This is our talk about the end of the week show. At Palomar, we did an end of the week show every week. And so Saturday morning, parents would come up, hang out in the bleachers, and kids would come up and perform a drill pattern that they had created to music. They would do a little bit of a vaulting showcase, and then there was a lot of glitter. We would let the girls groom their horses before and braid and put in fun bands, and then extra strong hold hair gel. And glitter is super fun because you can make some really awesome patterns on your horses and just have a really good time with it. Hannah's Camp Skylark did something a little bit similar, but also a little bit different.
So at Skylark Ranch, we only had a horse show for our advanced application-based riding group that was called Tally-Ho. These were teenage riders that could jump up to 3-foot courses, and they had a very riding intensive schedule at camp. They would do a flat lesson and a jumping lesson every day. So our Tally-Ho horse show was a little bit more of a serious experience than what Jill was talking about. So we would have our campers do a prep party the night before. They would get to stay up late with their riding instructors, and they would make signs and decorations for the horse show. And we would watch horse-themed movies, eat popcorn, and do fun stuff like that. The horse show was somewhat similar in that friends and parents were invited to attend, and other campers could also come watch if they had space in their schedule. The format of the show itself was very similar to that of just your regular horse show. There would be flat classes and over fences classes, as well as a catch ride where they would ride a horse they'd never ridden before. But we did find ways to jazz it up a little bit. We would have them make show names for their horses. So they would take their horse's name and add something to it to make it more like a fancy show name. And of course, we would give them ribbons. Everybody loves to get a ribbon. It doesn't matter if you want to do places or just have everybody get the same ribbon, but if your kids have never ridden in a horse show before, that's something that everybody finds really exciting. Honestly, if I could change one thing about my camp experience, I would include a horse show for each riding session. Like Jill said, I think the horse show is a really exciting experience for campers, and I would encourage everybody to include it in a camp program.
The awesome thing is that these horse shows create a bit of a sense of finality for everyone. So it's an easy way to wrap up the end of the week. Parents are already there to pick up, and you can kind of move everything on and just get on with your day. Thank you guys so much for spending some time with us and learning about camp. We hope that you use this information to create a fun and safe camp program or to change up your regular IR lessons in your daily lives. For our Q&A session later on, please send your favorite silly song or camp activity to me at seekerjillian@gmail.com, and we will read off those and we'll talk about our favorite things about camp. And if you guys have any questions for Hannah or I, please send them on and we will chat about that in our Q&A session. Thank you so much again. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.